Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Glenn Greenwald. He's an investigative journalist, and he's also the host of System Update on Rumble. Welcome back, Glenn. I know it's been a minute.
Yeah, it's always great to be with you guys. Big fan of your show, so happy to be on it whenever I can be.
So I know we have quite a bit to catch up on, and I want to go back to 2024, Kamala Harris becoming the nominee for the Democratic Party. It was really interesting to me, and I know you were one of the people that were very vocal about this at that time. There were a number of people when Joe Biden was still the nominee that said they refused to support Joe Biden because of the genocide in Gaza, which I heavily supported and agreed with. But it seemed like the moment that Kamala Harris became the nominee, and she also was not willing to waver on weapons to Israel. And then there was also the comment that she yelled at a protester where she said, if you want to keep it up, keep that up if you want Donald Trump. Otherwise, I'm speaking, etc. All of these people that, and some of them who had supported Jill Stein, were able to move over very quickly and try to make the case for Kamala Harris. And I know you were very vocal about you couldn't believe that people were able to pivot that way. And I want to hear a little bit more about that from you. And why do you think that was?
So first of all, in terms of the people who had been claiming they wouldn't vote for Joe Biden because of the relentless and unlimited onslaught that he greenlit and armed and funded in Israel against Gaza, I was never quite convinced that very many of those people who were claiming they wouldn't vote for Joe Biden would in fact not vote for Joe Biden. It was a little bit easy for them to say that because the election was still many months away. And we've seen a lot of times in mainstream left commentary, and I put left in quotation marks there, that there's a lot of posturing going on about radical opposition to the Democratic Party when it actually doesn't matter. But sort of every 18 months when the election is approaching, and then certainly when the election is there, they start to concoct ways to justify voting for the person whom they said they wouldn't vote for previously. And I think you would have seen a lot of that with Joe Biden. I think you actually saw people already gearing up to do that, including people who were pretending to be so morally offended by the genocide that Joe Biden was overseeing and paying for. So I question whether or not they really would have stuck to that commitment. Obviously, I'm not talking here about the hardcore activists, the Muslim and Arab voters, the real leftists. I think those people were serious about that, both with Biden and Kamala. But I think a lot of it was, branding exercises, people who were trying to show they were radical and outside the party, but at the end of the day, always snap into line. You know who those people are. When Kamala Harris was the replacement, obviously, the people on the left knew, and I'm talking here about the pro-DNC left, that they had a major problem, which is that they had a lot of people who they thought were going to be excited, thought were going to be energized, that would help the Kamala Harris campaign, who had become completely disgusted and turned off, and even unwilling to vote for the ticket because not just Joe Biden, but Kamala Harris had never uttered a peep of a willingness to stand up to Israel. And one of the most disgusting things I saw during the election, once Kamala Harris was imposed on the Democratic Party, was a lot of people started pretending deceitfully that there were things she had said that somehow signaled a willingness to deviate from Joe Biden's unstinting support for Israel, that she was trying to show she had more sympathy or empathy for the Palestinians. This was all a lie. Kamala Harris, in her entire career, has never shown a single brave action to deviate from party dogma or dogma that might help her career on any issue, let alone the issue of Israel. In fact, the first thing she did when she got elected in 2017 was she co-sponsored a resolution condemning Barack Obama for having allowed the UN resolution that declared Israeli settlements in the West Bank to be instituted by the UN. She condemned Obama for abstaining and saying he should have vetoed the election. She's a lifetime AIPAC loyalist. She comes from California. That's where there's a ton of money there. So the self-deception I found really repulsive, given that these people had been pretending to find this to be a great moral issue of our time. But I think at the end of the day, the question has to be, we can all pretty much agree that it's morally permissible to vote for one party over the other if we think they're really better, even if we disagree with that party on certain issues. That's just the nature of a two-party system, or even a multipolar party system. You're always going to have that. But when you're talking about accusing a political party of having enabled one of the worst genocides in modern history, funding it, arming it, protecting it diplomatically, justifying it, lying about it, and then you go and turn around and try and find ways to justify voting for those people that you've been accusing of having perpetrated a genocide, I think that's when those people irrevocably prove themselves to be utter and complete frauds who deserve no further attention ever again.
I agree with you. And I think a lot of that has been audience capture. I also think that the Democratic Party, which I did reveal, there were a number of influencers that were paid by the Democratic Party to heavily push Kamala Harris, and they were some of the accounts on Twitter that were heavily attacking people. And I said, let me look into some of these people, and you come to find out they were paid by the Democratic Party, of course, typical response. But I think part of it could be audience capture, where it's like they have developed an audience that is pro-Democratic Party, particularly those that come from the Bernie Sanders left, where even they told you after Bernie, of course, was denied the nomination from the Democratic Party that it's better to support Hillary Clinton or it's better to support Joe Biden so that you don't get Donald Trump, never held the line. And one of the things that I've always argued is that part of the reason why we have not been able to get some of these progressive wins on a national level is because the large scale YouTube media that pushed for those particular policies in the end always caves to the establishment Democrats. And I don't understand how people have not seen this game or figured out this game at this point in time.
It's so blatantly obvious. I go back to my days as a litigator where you would sue another party or that party would sue you. And of course, there was a chance that it would end up going to trial and you would try and destroy each other. But generally, everybody understood that the likely outcome was going to be a settlement. So you sit down and you try and find a resolution to the conflict that has been initiated. I mean, this is, very, very basic. So when you look at the left-wing YouTubers and the like, you see something that's just so simple-minded, because in those negotiations I just described, the only way you can get a resolution, the only way you can facilitate a settlement between two parties is if both parties have a credible threat that if they don't get what they want, not everything that they want, but enough that they want that they believe they've been satisfied, they're going to walk away from the negotiating table and they're going to go to war. If you don't have that threat, and that threat is credible, if everybody knows that you're so desperate to get a settlement early on because you don't want to pay lawyers' fees or you're afraid of what's going to come out, you lose all your leverage. And the other side is never going to agree to a good deal because you've already shown yourself that you're desperate for a resolution. And this is something that these Democratic Party activists who perceive themselves on the left, who have pretended to be engaged in activism in the Democratic Party, either don't understand or don't want to understand, which is that you can sit there for 14 months and say, I'm a communist dude. I hate Nancy Pelosi. I hate Chuck Schumer. I hate the Democratic Party. These people are crap. But if at the end of the day, they know that you're going to always herd all of your audience into the Democratic Party and tell them that they have to vote for the Democratic Party, whether those critiques have been responded to or not, why in the world would the Democratic Party ever listen to the people who in advance announce, I'm always going to vote for you no matter how much you hate me, no matter how much you spit in my face, no matter how much scorn you heap on my agenda? And that's why these people on the left have zero influence, and they deserve it. The people who have influence in our political process are the people on the right who say, if you elect George Jeb Bush or some establishment figure, or if you do this or you don't do that, you don't have my vote. Or the centrist Democrats, who have always said, if we don't get what we want, we're not going to vote. Those are the people with leverage. They have an understanding of how to express basic power. And I do think you're right that a lot of these left-leaning media people, the YouTubers, the streamers, the people everyone knows we're talking about, absolutely have audience capture. The kind of ticket to decent Democratic Party standing is that you tell people to go and vote Democrat. That you don't get AOC on your streaming if you don't. You don't get a DNC invitation if you don't do that. That's the requirement. You don't get on CNN. But what really bothers me is there are a lot of like mid-sized YouTubers or people just starting off. I understand they don't really have very much. They're trying to build their audience. If they lost a big part of their audience, it could be we're talking here about people who have made a ton of money pretending to believe in certain causes. And they have zero willingness to confront their own audience, to maybe lose 5% of their audience share because they say in this case, genocide is over the line. And the Democrats don't deserve our vote. And maybe next time they'll listen to, they're such cowards. I think that they're so desperate for mainstream acceptability, for their audience to like them. And that's why I find this part of the left to be one of the most pitiful and impotent parts, because everything about them is a fraud.
Very well said. And then we fast forward to election night, which I live streamed that, and it was almost laughable because a number of us had made predictions going into that day who we thought was going to win. And I predicted that Donald Trump was going to win every swing state. And there were a number of people who said, oh, you're just a Trump supporter in secret. I'm like, no, the data just shows me this, because one of the things I think that more people should do is talk to voters on the ground. And one of the things I did was that I talked to people on the ground. And what I noticed is there was not that energy for Kamala Harris. And yeah, a lot of people still said that Trump is bad and I'm tired of Trump, but it didn't motivate them to come out and vote at all. And that's what I was warning people about, is I'm not hearing a lot of people saying they're going to vote third party. I'm not hearing a lot of people saying they're going to support Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Most of the people I spoke to said that they were just going to stay at home. And ultimately, we see that's what happened. But as we noticed, corporate media, particularly CNN and MSNBC that night, they seemed to be very shocked when Donald Trump won those blue wall states, even though we had been warning for quite some time. Kamala Harris is going to struggle to win Michigan because of the Arab American population there. And you can't win Michigan without Detroit or the Detroit suburb areas. That includes Dearborn, Michigan, which she did not go to. And so what I thought was happening is that Kamala's consultant team was telling her, try to energize women and get the women to come out and vote over the overturn of Roe v. Wade. What I feel like they did not realize is, number one, that was not going to replace the Arab American vote in Michigan. And number two, even some of the women that were against the overturn of Roe v. Wade will tell you, thinking about it, maybe it does belong in the state. So it's a bad assumption to believe that all of these women in the U.S. are going to come out and vote on that issue when that was not the number one issue for most people that I spoke to. How do you feel about the way corporate media, particularly liberal corporate media, fell out like after that, and all the ratings, like the ratings dropped for CNN and MSNBC after that as well?
I think that, and I'm not saying this is uncommon for societies, it's often the case that elites tend to have a breach with the non-elites, the people to whom they're reporting, on whose behalf they're speaking. But in the United States, especially in our media and political class, this breach has almost become French Revolution-like. The kind of Washington elite set only speak to and for one another. It's incredibly incestuous. Washington is like a big, gigantic Versailles. It's like a royal court. Nobody's allowed in it. The rest of the country is just kind of on the outside looking in and understands that they have no conception of what's taking place outside their tiny little circle, let alone concern for what is taking place. And so I understand, I really do, why it is that if most of your life is spent in Washington and New York green rooms and corporate news meetings, and you're talking to people whose friends, who are your friends, who wrote op-eds for the Washington Post and the New York Times, and there's all the, and the Atlantic, and it's all this resistance dreck, and everyone understands that Donald Trump is this existential evil to all things about American norms. In your world, that's the only thing that matters. Donald Trump is a white supremacist. You know, Kamala Harris is a very decent person. And then you have the entire rest of the country that is speaking a completely different language. They're talking about utterly different things. And I think the most important comment by a Democratic Party leader was back in 2020 when it became apparent that Democrats were losing a lot of working class voters, not just white working class voters, but multiracial working class voters. And when asked about that, Chuck Schumer said, oh, don't worry, for every working class voter that we lose, we're going to replace 2 affluent women in the suburbs, meaning standard Republican voters are now suddenly going to vote Democrat. And that just isn't what happened, because the Democratic Party has no self-identity. They have no story that they're telling. They have no set of convictions and beliefs outside of a very narrow range of cultural issues where they have a kind of clear identity, but even they're not as clear as it could be. But those just aren't the things that people wake up and worried about. Nobody is waking up and worried about January 6th. Nobody's waking up and worried about Liz Cheney's prosecution. Nobody's waking up and worried about Russia or any of these things that these media outlets spend all their time talking about. So if you're stuck within them, if you're drowning within them, it's no wonder that you thought Hillary Clinton or that Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton were going to sweep all the swing states, because in your world, there is no real dissent to any of that.
100%. And then there's this issue. Well, now that Donald Trump is elected, we have seen just how much a president can do in a very short time. All of these executive orders that Donald Trump has signed, even on the first day, were like, he's doing exactly what he said he was going to do, which is why I was kind of surprised that some people were shocked by that. I'm like, he said he was going to do those things. You know, what you should be asking is, why were the Democrats so bad that they could not beat Donald Trump again? And I feel like the blame should go on the Democratic Party for being so weak that they could not beat him again. But it points to another particular issue, and that is with Gaza. We go into the Trump, up until the days Trump is about to enter the White House. And all of a sudden, the news is reporting that Donald Trump is meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu and is going to make this ceasefire happen. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden stand up and they give a press conference about it. And of course, take credit for it and say, we told you we were working on this or whatever. But we all know that Benjamin Netanyahu made it very clear that it was Donald Trump's negotiation with him that made him change his mind, which showed us that Biden and Kamala could have made the ceasefire agreement actually work last year and not resist to Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't believe that they wanted to make it work. I believe that if Kamala Harris would have won, they would still be allowing Israel to bomb Gaza right now. Now, this is not to say that Donald Trump obviously hasn't made this type of deal with Netanyahu where he can go into the West Bank, which I heavily am against. But it sends a message to the voters that the Republican Party seems to be proactive and the Democratic Party seems to be reactive. And while I'm seeing Democrats get upset and angry with all of these orders that Donald Trump is passing, I feel like the response should be, why is it that when Democrats win the White House, why aren't they as aggressive to pass legislation that could benefit the American people? And I'm curious about your thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point and an interesting point, and I'll use Kamala Harris as the example. I didn't really pay much attention to Kamala Harris until she got to the Senate. I wasn't, so focused on what she was doing as Attorney General in California. And I really noticed her when she was on the Senate Judiciary Committee and began interrogating a lot of Trump judicial nominees, including Brett Kavanaugh, but others as well. And as a lawyer, I found her remarkably effective. Like, I thought she was the most effective person on that committee. She has a very skilled in-court questioning. She's very aggressive and insistent on answers. She does a very good job of making the witness look like they're dishonest, and I actually walked away pretty impressed with the way in which she was able to do that. After that, almost everything that I saw from Kamala Harris, the presidential campaign, but especially the vice presidency, it was like a completely different person. You know, she went from having a lot of confidence in the kind of interrogation she was doing in these committee hearings. Why? Because she had been a lawyer her whole life. That's what she knows best, the criminal law, the civil law, how to interrogate people, and she had a lot of high confidence with it, and she was very effective. The minute she gets into the vice presidency, she's so petrified, and I don't even mean she, I mean people around her are so petrified that they're going to say like a wrong word, or they're going to go off script for even 1 second. And so when you watch these Democratic Party leaders, not just Kamala, but she was particularly bad about it, but pretty much all of the Democratic Party leaders, they speak in these like very disciplined talking points, and they seem afraid of their own belief system. They seem petrified to say anything in a normal way of speaking, because if they deviate at all, they're going to somehow get exposed. And if you look at the contrast with Donald Trump and now increasingly the Republican administration that's being made in his mold, the contrast could not be any starker. They believe what they believe. How many times has Donald Trump said things that we were told was a career ender because he just wasn't very careful? And you see Republicans just speaking off the cuff without the slightest hesitation or concern. And I really think if you know people in your personal life and you notice this kind of behavioral contrast, usually the differences between people who don't really believe in much and don't have confidence in their belief system and people who do, for better or for worse. And I do think, Sabby, it's so interesting, you know, for so long, ever since I've been writing about politics, liberals and people on the left who identify with the Democratic Party have been so angry that the Democrats always come up with some completely lame, bureaucratic, weak reason why they can't do the things they promise their voters, like, oh, we would love to give single-payer healthcare system or raise the minimum wage, but unfortunately the parliamentarian of the Senate ruled that we can't do that unless we get overcome a filibuster. And it's like, who is the parliamentarian of the Senate, and why are you being so observant? And then you look at Donald Trump, what he's doing, and he's on a rampage. And I think, just like in January 6th, I think there was a little bit of jealousy on the left that, oh, we've always considered ourselves the rebels who get off the couch and go and fight institutional power when we think we've been wronged, and then watch actually Donald Trump supporters do that. I think there's a little bit of jealousy here that the Republicans won, Democrats have won plenty of elections, and you didn't see anything remotely like the level of determination to implement the agenda on which the Republicans ran because they believe in it, and just kind of running roughshod over every impediment in their way. And I think this is where you see the two differences. Americans know that Donald Trump says a bunch of obnoxious and ill-informed and offensive things. They're not unaware of that. But when it comes to a group of people who are just willing to speak normally, who speak like human beings, who have a kind of conviction, who aren't afraid to go off course, and a party that just is always speaking in talking points and seems so puckered up and so, you know, just kind of bereft of any real value, of course the American people are going to opt for those who seem like they believe in something, because the Democrats, their main problem is that other than just getting along with institutional Washington, they really don't have any core beliefs that animated them at this point.
This is the point I was trying to get across to people as well, which is that when you fail the working class, if you could say you're the party of the working people, and you fail those people over and over again, and you choose to enrich Wall Street and the military industrial complex, eventually what will happen is that people swing all the way over to the other side. And I saw that in particular with this election as well, where there are a number of groups that the Democratic Party typically depends on in order to win. As much as corporate media is talking about Black women coming out and voting for Kamala Harris in heavy numbers, they're not telling you that Black men did not. They're not telling you that overall Kamala Harris lost the Black vote. When you compare her to Biden, Hillary Clinton, and of course Barack Obama, it has decreased since Barack Obama over the years. Black people have been leaving the Democratic Party. Then there's the Latino vote. which we also see took a huge, a right towards Donald Trump. And a lot of this had to do with the issue of immigration. And I think this is something that Democrats really did not want to hear. I spoke with a number of people in person who were not happy with the way that immigration is being treated in this country. There were people that are part of sanctuary cities that had complained about this over and over again and were ignored by the Biden administration. Mayor Wu here in Boston has been summoned by Congress to testify about Boston being a sanctuary city and some of the practices that happened here over the Biden administration. But Mayor Wu reached out to the Biden administration multiple times for help, and there was no response. She reached out and said, we cannot continue to keep this up, and they didn't want anything to do with it. So now she's being brought forward to Congress. I think the immigration issue was a big one for people. At the same time, and I noticed one of your tweets about this as well, now I'm seeing people go all the way to the other extreme, where people on Twitter are telling Ilhan Omar that she needs to be deported. And Ilhan Omar is a citizen of the United States. So now it's just, I feel like it's one side is all the way over to this end and the other side is all the way over to that end. But I feel like now people are just trying to like heavily attack anyone who may say something that they feel they heavily disagree with. And my biggest concern with the immigration issue is that now we do have an executive order from Donald Trump to go after those pro-Palestinian protesters, the students who are here that are international students, and deport them, have them lose their visas. And I feel like this has taken a whole other shift. And I'm curious about your opinion about that.
Yeah, you probably noticed this too, but and it's something that you don't notice until you live through multiple elections. I remember very well in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan led the Republican Party to a unseating of an incumbent president in 1980, and then a smashing re-election defeat in 1984 against Walter Mondale, and then a third straight national election where George H.W. Bush defeated Michael Dukakis. And the idea at the time was, Democrats are finished. Everybody hates Democrats. Republicans have figured out how to appeal to the party, and they're going to rule forever because their ideology is favorable. Fast forward 4 years later, Bill Clinton wins the White House from George H.W. Bush with the help from Ross Perot. He then easily wins re-election. You had, a very close election with 2000. Bush's re-election in 2004, but then you had Obama for 8 years and then Biden for 4 years. So almost always in politics, when a political movement overreads its mandate, it tends to destroy itself and create a backlash that brings the other party back into power. I think there's almost, if you look at every issue, it has the capacity to bring out the worst in people or to incite violent impulses. For example, if you say, I think abortion is murder, you may very well motivate people to look at all abortion doctors and say, oh, these people are murderers and they deserve to be prosecuted and imprisoned or even killed because they're killing babies. On the other hand, if you stay up and say the exact opposite, which is women's clinics are absolutely vital to saving women's health, you could inspire people to attack anybody who is trying to shut down women's health because now they perceive that is a danger. And I think the same is true as immigration. People clearly have good faith, non-racist, non-hateful reasons for being concerned about the effects of immigration. These trends generally affect working class neighborhoods, racially diverse neighborhoods. There is no immigration problem in Northern Virginia or in Beverly Hills or in Upper West Side of Manhattan. And so again, you see this sort of breach. But I do agree with you that one of the things that has happened is that with this whole declaration that wokeism is over, that it's now open season on immigration, it has kind of given license to a sort of very ugly sentiment that you're seeing more and more of that is the result of that victory. But that's what I mean. A lot of times these things produce that kind of backlash. I do think it can be nervous, but I generally, and maybe I'm being naive here, do not believe that most of the Republican Party, most Republican voters have this visceral hatred for all people who are immigrants. In so many parts, because so many of their families have been immigrants. I think it's kind of this fringe that has found an emboldened platform on places like social media, and perhaps it seems like it's more significant than it really is. Again, maybe that's naive. That's what I'm hoping for, but we do have to be very vigilant against it.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of that. And I want to go to the big billionaire problem here. I know a lot of people are getting tired of Elon Musk. He's everywhere. And now, there's a big backlash against him because he, locked out those federal employees, and which is exactly, again, what they said they were going to do. So now some people are sitting back, and even some people reached out to me privately, and they said that they feel like Elon Musk was actually on the ticket and not Donald Trump. And what I've been trying to explain to people is that, unfortunately, the Democratic Party doesn't say no to billionaire money either. And if they did, I feel like their pushback would have even more weight, because they could say, we're the party that doesn't take billionaire money, and no, we should not have billionaires running our government, right? But they can't say that, because it's like they're ranting about it. They're holding rallies about it, but they take billionaire money too. So no, they didn't put a billionaire like in the cabinet. But I mean, you're there with George Soros, you're there with Bill Gates, so there's different billionaires. We just saw the new DNC chair that was just elected said, we're going to still take money from the good billionaires. And I continue to tell people that billionaires exploit the workers. So let's refer to them in that sense. But the billionaire issue is a big problem. And I think what has happened with Elon Musk in particular is that he has pulled the cover off. Now it's really out in the open where people are saying, oh my God, this guy isn't even a politician. He's a billionaire. He's just making decisions in our government. But that has been the case for quite some time. But I feel like now it is more front and center. So now people can't ignore it. Do you think that this could push more people to try to get Democrat leadership to go against taking billionaire money and detaching themselves from people like Bill Gates as well?
So much of the kind of breach that I had with the mainstream left in the age of Trump, and I know this is true of you as well, is I watch so often this dishonest attempt be created to suggest that something that Donald Trump was doing was a singular evil, that no other president had previously even considered doing it, that it was so far outside of the American norms that it was shocking to watch. I remember very well when the 2008 financial crisis happened, right at the end of the 2008 presidential election, where Barack Obama defeated John McCain. And if you look at the people that Barack Obama hired in order to guide the country and guide the administration out of that financial crisis, his primary advisor was Jamie Dimon, the head of Citigroup, who, if not a billionaire, is very close. They tapped Timothy Geithner to be the Treasury Secretary, who was the darling of Wall Street, because while at the New York Fed, he basically gave them everything they wanted. And you had Larry Summers, that whole neoliberal crowd of very, very wealthy Wall Street and big tech tycoons who were guiding the government out of that crisis. And that's the reason why all the tycoons ended up being bailed out and all the middle class ended up being left to drown. So, and I would also say that even if you go back further, like FDR and JFK Jr., it's always been very common to kind of call on successful business people and billionaires to try and help the government understand certain things, to listen to their advice. What Elon is doing is so radically different because he's clearly been deputized by Donald Trump to basically run rampage throughout the entire government. But as you said, the problem that Democrats have, it reminds me a little bit of the problem of trying to criticize Donald Trump for his plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza. What moral basis do the Democrats have for criticizing anybody on Gaza, given that it was turned into complete rubble under their watch? of course the Democrats are suffused with billionaire influence. And the idea that maybe they're going to someday give that up, I think is so fanciful. I used to hope that, I used to think that, but the structure of the Democratic Party, the way in which it is built, the way in which it was designed going back to the early 1990s under Bill Clinton, is that it would be the party of Wall Street. It would be the party of big Silicon Valley money. And as Chuck Schumer said, the goal is to get rid of working class voters and replace them with affluent suburbanites. And it's too embedded in the party's character to start saying, we're not going to have anything to do with Alex Soros or Laurene Powell Jobs or Melinda French or Bill Gates. It's so part of the Democratic Party endemically that I can't understand how you could ever extricate it without almost starting a new party.
Starting a new party. And that brings up another question. This is my last question for you, which is that some people will look at people like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., at least on the Republican side, and they'll look at people like AOC, well, let's put AOC out of this equation. She's far gone. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, and they'll say these individuals should be a part of a separate party. They should not be a part of the two-party system, and they could be under a party where their ideas and issues could get more leverage and could have like some type of a movement behind them, right? Whether I agree with them or not. We looked at Tulsi Gabbard's hearing, for example, and I don't agree with Tulsi Gabbard on a lot policy-wise, but it was ridiculous to me to see Congress members or sit up there and tell her that she should have to say that Edward Snowden is a traitor. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Edward Snowden, not from Congress. I think they're just doing their part to keep their seats, but I think from the general public. And the first time I interviewed you, we talked about Edward Snowden. A lot of people seem to have this misconception that Edward Snowden defied the government and was a traitor and then just fled to Russia. And one of the things I tried to correct, at least during that hearing with Tulsi Gabbard, which is that, number one, I don't think Edward Snowden is a traitor. And I understand Tulsi like pushing back on that, but also this idea that he just jumped on a plane and said, I'm fleeing to Russia. And I want to hear a little bit from you about that. Where does this lead with journalism and truth telling and movement building? Because ultimately what we see happening is not just Edward Snowden. Richie Medhurst was just searched in Austria. This is the second time. He was detained before. He's not even from Austria, but he was there. I thought they were supposed to be neutral, right? So we've seen that. We've seen Jeremy Lafredo from the Gray Zone was arrested and detained in Israel. There have been a number of journalists that are being attacked, people who are truth tellers or truth seekers or outside of that establishment norm. And then you see people trying to build something different, like a Jill Stein and a Shama Sawant. And Shama Sawant right now is being denied an emergency visa to go visit her mother in India who is sick. That is coming directly from Modi. What do you think is going to happen when we talk about movement building, starting something new, when the people who are trying to report the truth that could help start something new are constantly being harassed, whether it's by the police or by intel?
Yeah, this is something I've obviously thought about a long time. I was heavily involved in the WikiLeaks story. I was heavily involved in the Snowden story. I had my own investigations in Brazil that caused a lot of tumult, and one of which ended up in my criminal prosecution that courts eventually were thrown out. But one of the things I've come to realize is that a lot of people like to say that they want to stand up to establishment power. They want to speak truth to power. They want to be dissidents. They want to, step outside of the kind of conventional thought that major capitals foster and that most people who are careerists are willing to embrace in order to advance their own career. It's a very tempting thing to say, yeah, I want to be able to be one of those people. I want to be brave. I want to, be outside and throw rocks and expose it and show it. And that is absolutely something that I hope my career has been about. I know a ton of people I respect who I think their career has been about that as well. But I think it's very important to understand historically that when you have a ruling class elite, a institution of power, whatever threats emerge to their hegemony, to their prerogatives, to their ongoing ability to reign supreme, they're going to attack it. And they're going to attack it in ways that really have no legal or ethical limits of any kind, because they feel like they're engaged in a fight for survival. And you look at the journalists, and for me, it's almost like a litmus test. The journalists who think that they're challenging government power or government policy, you know, like Jim Acosta wrote that book that, I'm sorry to bring that up, it just makes me so sick, where he kind of depicted himself on the cover as endangered, and the title of the book was A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth in Trump's America, because he was from CNN and asked Trump a few questions. If you look at what actually happens to people who bother power all over the world, these are the Julian Assanges and the Edward Snowdens and so many others who end up dead, or who end up, you know, exiled or prosecuted, or persecuted in all sorts of ways. But at the end of the day, you know, that is the only way to do it. That is an inevitable outcome. You know, every time I've embarked on one of these stories where I felt like those risks were there, I tried to be very open-eyed about the fact that, you know, you can't have the fun that you think you're having in throwing rocks at powerful institutions and then expect that they're not going to throw rocks back at you. So when you look at, and I'll just use this as an example since you brought it up, the demonization of Edward Snowden, and so much of it is based on lies. You know, there's nothing like, a lot of people understand the media lies, but there's nothing like understanding that for real in a visceral way when you're at the center of a story and you have firsthand information of most of what has happened. And you see how often in these media outlets with such authoritative tones, they're asserting things that you know for a fact are false. It was continuous. And, you know, the idea that Snowden first ran to China, that in itself is so misleading. He purposely picked Hong Kong because he needed a safe place to be able to get us the materials without the CIA interrupting. And to him, Hong Kong was a symbol of resistance to mainland China. It was, you know, a place with a long history of fighting against mainland China and having protests of independence. And then when he left Hong Kong after meeting with us and working with us, his plan was to transit through from Hong Kong to Russia, from Russia to Havana, from Havana onto Latin America, where he intended to seek asylum. And he got a guarantee of safe passage to go from Russia to Havana and Havana to South America. The Cubans said, we know the Americans are going to want us to nab you if you come here, but we guarantee you that you will be able to pass through safely and we won't turn you over to the Americans. When the Americans found out about that, they went ballistic. They threatened Cuba. At the time, Cuba was trying to get normalized relations with the United States. And Biden officials boasted in books that they called the Cubans and said, if you want normalized relations with us, you better withdraw your passage, your guarantee of safe passage for Snowden through Havana. And that, combined with invalidating his passport on the flight from Hong Kong to Russia, meant they trapped him in Russia. He could not leave. And then they used the fact that he's in Russia to suggest that somehow what he did is nefarious. It's like locking somebody into a basement with a padlock and then blaming them for being irresponsible because they're not taking care of the kids. You're the one who imprisoned them there. So you just have to know that if you're going to be a dissident, if you're going to be a meaningful opponent of establishment power, these kinds of demonization campaigns are going to come, and they're going to come very aggressively. And there's going to be a lot of media force behind them. And the one thing, Sabby, that makes me optimistic about all of these things, including that, is the emergence now of independent media, which has its flaws, is not perfect, but at the same time allows people to hear for the first time other sides of the story, because this small handful of big corporations no longer has monopoly power over the flow of information.
Well said. Glenn Greenwald, thank you so much for your time.
Always great to see you. Keep up the great work.
Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.